Grandmaster here, Nerdinsky. Daniel at the 2022 FIDE World Splits Championship. Grandmaster Vladimir Kovalov is competing against world champion Magnus Carlsen. As the arbiter and Kovalov, who is reclining back and playing e4, engage in the game, they have a brief conversation. Usually, Magnus Carlsen likes to arrive fashionably late. However, with the time control set at 3 minutes per side with a 2-second increment, it's quite unusual for one of the opponents to be absent from their chair when the game begins. Currently, 15 seconds have passed, and Kovalov eagerly awaits the opportunity to play against the world champion, who is nowhere to be found. While still in the same position, Carlsen's clock has reached 30 seconds, and he has already made his move with e4. It's possible that he is deciding which opening to play, but there is a time for preparation and a time for playing, and now 35 seconds have elapsed. I believe I see Fabiano Caruana looking back from a diagonal position. What happened is that there was traffic in the competition hall, causing one player to be late. But where's the world champion? Someone is rushing to his chair, and it seems to be you, Yangi's opponent. The most absurd thing, of course, is that Magnus Carlsen may still play a fine game with only 20 or 30 seconds left on the clock. But that would be completely absurd. Magnus Carlsen still hasn't arrived even after 1 minute has passed. Kovalov has remained in the same sitting position throughout. Now it's 1 minute and 20 seconds. Perhaps Magnus got confused about the starting time of the round, but usually, the starting time is announced before the previous round begins, so everyone else seemed to know when the round was starting. 90 seconds have now elapsed from the Magnus Carlsen's clock, which is more than half his allotted time. What's fascinating is that he hasn't changed his sitting position at all. He scans the tournament hall, searching for the world champion. Naturally, he doesn't want to win the game by 4 feet, as it would be a disappointing way to defeat the world champion. He desires the opportunity to play a blitz game with him. You can sense his disappointment on his face. There's only 1 minute left on the world champion's clock, and his chair remains empty. This is unbelievable. I've never witnessed anything like this. With less than a minute remaining, Magnus Carlsen has to rush to his chair and start playing. After what feels like 2,000 years, there he is. The world champion has arrived. He is running, trying to find his chair, and at least it's on. Oh my goodness. He is running up to the podium. He needs to locate his board with approximately 40 seconds before losing the game. He dashes madly and makes it in time. He sits down, shakes hands, and plays 1 e6. Perhaps he was choosing an opening all this time, which would be quite intriguing. Magnus Carlsen has 31 seconds left, as he implies the French defense and executes the exchange variation, a relatively straightforward opening for black to blitz out the moves such as knight c3. Perhaps the advance would have forced Magnus Carlsen to slow down instead of Kovalov with an early move c4, which often leads to an isolated queen-pawn structure if, of course, black takes on c4. However, Magnus Carlsen delayed that move. With a significant time advantage like Kovalov has, there are many moves that can be played with a bishop at position b2. Nevertheless, Carlsen can play well even with only 5 seconds left on the clock, while Kovalov has already spent a minute making this move. Finally, on move 5, Kovalov decides to move his knight to position c3. The threat on the d5 pawn castles is simply ignored by Carlsen. If white takes on d5, that pawn will be a sitting duck, can be easily recaptured by black's other knight, which will move to d7 and then to b6. Once black recaptures the pawn on d5, he will have a very nice blocketing knight to immobilize white's isolated queen pawn on d4. Another 20 seconds are spent by Kovalov, possibly to level the playing field. He takes on d5, covers the check with a rook, captures Magnus Carlsen's knight. Carlsen brings his knight to d7, adjusts a few pieces, and then presses the timer, completely unconcerned that he now has more time than when he began. However, he did begin with 30 seconds. Kovalev castles kingside, and Carlsen continues adjusting his pieces. I honestly believe the world champion is in a fantastic position here and will prevail. The pawn on d5 will be supported by a strong blockading knight on d5. Kovalev is trying to gain activity for his other pieces with a knight to e5, but Carlsen ignores the knight and captures the pawn on d5. Maybe after a trade, Kovalev should try to position his light-squared bishop on f3 to chase the knight away from d5, but Carlsen could support it with the bishop from c8, which could go to e6, or with the pawn, which could move from c7 to c6. There is no question that Black's position is probably already slightly better, and look at the time. The time situation is almost equalized. It's unbelievable. Kovalev has spent a total of 2 minutes on the first 5 or 6 moves, and now he has 30 seconds himself. They're basically playing a hyper-bullet game with increment. Carlsen indeed pushes the pawn up to c6, protecting his knight on d5. If I'm Kovalev, I would consider trading pieces on d5, but he doesn't. He brings his queen out to b3, putting more pressure on the world champion's knight, and now he threatens to capture on d5 3 times. Kovalev takes the knight, and we are likely to see a lot of exchanges. The queens are very likely to be taken off the board, either by white or possibly even by black. White could also take on d5 twice, as Carlsen leans back in his chair and finally starts taking the very little time he has left, 15 seconds on the clock. He brings his own queen up to b6, offering an exchange of queens. Only 3 seconds left, he moves his bishop out, feeling irritated that he must make these maneuvers out of fear of running out of time. Carlsen still had 15 seconds left as he pursued Kovalev's only Act 2 piece out of the center. He planned to bring his light-squared bishop to either f5 or e6 to secure the isolated queen pawn. However, before that, he brought his rook up to a4 and attacked the d4 pawn. Next, he attacked the knight, but there were no good squares for it to move to, so Kovalev had to bring it back to e1. Moving the knight, Carlsen pulls the rook to c4, moves his bishop up to b5, threatening to make a move to b4. The bishops are off the board. Kovalev is being tormented and crushed on the queen side. In these kinds of endgames, the world champion doesn't allow any breathing room and has positioned his pawns ideally to restrict the white king and knight as much as possible. The knight can't move to d3 because it would lose the d4 pawn, and it can't move to c2 because it would lose the b2 pawn. Kovalev manages to defend the b2 pawn. Carlsen slowly moves his king over to the queen side with moves like king b5 and king c6, and eventually something will give. Kovalev essentially has to wait and try to improve the position of his knight. He did a great job getting the knight into the center and chasing Black's light-squared bishop away. With 6 seconds remaining for Kovalev, Carlsen is still maneuvering and trying to infiltrate White's position. White's rook is currently stationed on a4, and Kovalev needs to keep it connected to one of his pawns by moving it up to a1. Kovalev's rook doesn't have any active prospects at the moment, but Carlsen's rook on d1 is keeping the gates to White's queenside closed. Carlsen continues to occupy space and stifle White's pieces. Kovalev's king moves up to b1, chasing the rook away, but the rook can go to the other side. It can go to the h8 and e8. It attacks the knight, which moves, but then Carlsen takes the bishop. Oh, but this looks bad for the Kovalev's king. Kovalev is somewhat stagnant, bringing his king up to d3, where it nearly gets checkmated by the bishop. A check on b5 drives the king back to c2 and now king b3. The pawn endgame would undoubtedly be lost for White, as is down a pawn, and Carlsen's connected passed pawns are advancing down the board. Kovalev tries to set his pawn in motion. but it's too slow and it gets blocked by Black's rook. Thus, Kovalov resigns the game. This is an exquisite endgame technique displayed by the world champion. He threatens to capture the other pawn on g4, leaving the Kovalov with only 2 seconds as he desperately tries to defend but ends up losing the second pawn on g4. Did you like it? Tell us what you think of the video in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting videos.